This is breaking news coming out of the Pentagon in the Middle East, where the geopolitical temperature has just spiked to a critical fever pitch. We are tracking a developing situation that has moved rapidly from diplomatic rhetoric to tangible, high-stakes military maneuvers. Moments ago, satellite imagery and defense officials confirmed that a massive U.S. naval strike group, described by observers as an armada of unprecedented scale, has crossed the threshold into the operational zones of the Persian Gulf. This is not a drill, and according to sources in Washington, this is no standard freedom of navigation exercise. This is a direct, kinetic message. The White House has issued what can only be described as an ultimatum. The demand is absolute, a total, verifiable, and immediate halt to the Islamic Republic of Iran's nuclear program. There is no gray area in the language coming out of the administration today. The directive suggests that the window for negotiation has not just closed, but has been boarded up. In response, the rhetoric from Tehran has matched the aggression step for step. Iran's supreme leader has just addressed the nation, vowing a crushing response to any violation of Iranian sovereignty, effectively placing the entire region on a hair-trigger alert. What we are witnessing right now is perhaps the most dangerous standoff in the region in decades. The markets are already reacting, with oil futures climbing as traders calculate the risk of a closed Strait of Hormuz. But beyond the economics, the immediate concern is the potential for miscalculation. With the sheer volume of firepower now concentrated in such a narrow body of water, the margin for error has evaporated. A single rogue drone, a misunderstood radar signature, or a nervous trigger finger could turn this standoff into a sprawling regional conflict before diplomats even have a chance to pick up the phone. This story is moving fast and the implications are global. To understand why this specific deployment is causing such alarm among seasoned intelligence analysts, we have to look past the headlines and look at the hardware. This isn't just a show of force, it is a siege configuration. The composition of the Naval Strike Group suggests an operational readiness for sustained air campaigns and ballistic missile defense. We are talking about billions of dollars of military assets parking on the doorstep of a rival power that has spent the last 20 years digging deep underground and arming a vast network of proxies. The pieces are on the board. The game has changed from containment to confrontation. What happened next shocked even seasoned investigators watching the satellite feeds. Usually, in these scenarios, there's a choreographed dance. A carrier moves in. The opposing side issues a statement, and things simmer down. That did not happen today. Instead of backing down or calling for United Nations intervention, Tehran's military apparatus went dark. Communication chatter spiked on encrypted channels, and mobile missile launchers were detected leaving their garrisons and moving into hardened, concealed positions along the coast. This silence from the operational commanders in Iran is louder than any press release. It suggests they are not preparing to talk, they are preparing to fight. This brings us to the core of the crisis. For years, the shadow war between Washington and Tehran has been fought in the gray zones. Through cyber attacks, espionage, and proxy skirmishes in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, it was a war of attrition, fought with plausible deniability. But the arrival of this armada signals the end of the shadow war and the beginning of something far more direct. The administration seems to have calculated that the only way to force a capitulation is through the credible threat of overwhelming force. However, history in the Middle East is littered with calculations that fail to account for the enemy's will to endure. The atmosphere in the Gulf states tonight is one of hushed anxiety. We are receiving reports from Doha, Riyadh, and Dubai that diplomatic cables are burning up. These nations, which host U.S. bases and sit within missile range of Iran, are caught directly in the crossfire. They know that if the first missile flies, their cities, their desalination plants, and their oil refineries are on the front line. The paradox here is striking. The U.S. Armada is there ostensibly to secure the region, yet its very presence has brought the region closer to the edge of the abyss than it has been since the height of the tanker wars in the 80s. But to truly grasp the stakes, we need to step back and look at the timeline that led us here. This did not happen in a vacuum. This is the culmination of a slow-motion car crash that began years ago when diplomatic frameworks began to fracture. The strategy of maximum pressure was designed to squeeze the Iranian economy until the leadership in Tehran had no choice but to come to the table. Instead, the pressure seems to have calcified their resolve. The logic in Tehran is that surrender equates to regime change, and for the supreme leader, that is an existential red line. Therefore, they view this American armada not as a negotiating tactic, but as an invasion force in waiting. The psychological component of this standoff cannot be overstated. U.S. intelligence agencies have long warned that a cornered Iran is a dangerous Iran. Without the economic release valve of oil sales and with internal dissent simmering, the regime may view an external conflict not as a disaster, but as a unifying necessity. A war with the great Satan fits the ideological narrative that has sustained the Islamic Republic since 1979. By parking an armada off their coast, the U.S. may be inadvertently handing the hardliners the exact enemy they need to rally a fractured population. It is a high-stakes gamble with human psychology on a massive scale. Furthermore, we must look at the nuclear dimension, which is the stated cause of this escalation. Washington demands a total halt. But experts warn that Iran's nuclear knowledge is no longer contained in a single facility that can be bombed into oblivion. It is in the minds of scientists, on hard drives, and dispersed across a deeply buried infrastructure. You cannot bomb knowledge. This reality raises the terrifying question. If the Armada strikes and the physical infrastructure is damaged, does it stop the program? Or does it merely convince Tehran that the only guarantee of survival is to sprint toward the bomb as fast as possible? As night falls over the Persian Gulf, the sailors on those U.S. ships and the Revolutionary Guard Corps members manning the coastal batteries are staring at the same stretch of black water. They are the human element in a game of geopolitical poker played by men in suits thousands of miles away. We have spoken to families of service members who were rapidly deployed in this surge. There is a sense of confusion and stoic duty. They are asking the question that is echoing in the halls of Congress and the United Nations. What is the endgame? Is this a blockade, a strike, or a bluff? The silence from the White House regarding the specific rules of engagement is deliberate. Ambiguity is a weapon. By not defining the red line, the U.S. hopes to force Iran to freeze out of caution. But ambiguity can also be fatal. If Tehran misinterprets a surveillance drone as an incoming strike, or if a U.S. destroyer mistakes a fishing vessel for a suicide boat, the chain reaction will be instantaneous. The automated defense systems on both sides operate in milliseconds. There will be no time for a hotline call to de-escalate. The war could start and spiral out of control before the president is even woken up to be told it has begun. We also have to consider the global energy implications. While the U.S. is largely energy independent, the rest of the world is not. A significant percentage of the world's daily oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz. If Iran follows through on its threat to mine, the strait, or attack tankers, the global economy would face a shockwave instantly. Inflation would skyrocket, supply chains would shatter, and the fragile post-pandemic economic recovery would be strangled in its crib. This is why European and Asian allies are frantically back-channeling with both Washington and Tehran, pleading for restraint. They know that a war in the Gulf is not just a local fire, it is a global arson. The intelligence community is currently divided on Iran's likely next move. One camp believes Tehran will engage in asymmetric escalation, cyber attacks on U.S. banks, activating sleeper cells, or hitting soft targets in third countries to demonstrate reach without triggering a full war. The other camp fears that the supreme leader believes war is inevitable and will choose to strike first to blood the nose of the American giant, hoping to make the cost of conflict too high for the U.S. public to stomach. This second scenario is the nightmare that keeps the Pentagon up at night. What is particularly chilling about this armada's arrival is the timing. It comes amidst a broader shifting of global alliances. Tehran has deepened its ties with other global powers that are adversarial to the United States. We are seeing a coalescing of interests where an attack on Iran might not remain isolated. If other superpowers decide to provide intelligence, satellite data, or advanced weaponry to Tehran during a conflict, the U.S. Navy could find itself facing a much more sophisticated threat environment than the asymmetric warfare of the last 2 decades. The chessboard is crowded and the pieces are armed. As we continue to monitor the live feeds from the region, one thing becomes painfully clear. The era of the status quo is over. The cold peace that held the Middle East together by a thread has snapped. We are now in a new phase of direct confrontation where the tools of diplomacy have been replaced by the tools of war. The Armada is not just a collection of ships. It is a statement that patience has run out. But as any historian of conflict will tell you, starting a war is easy. It is ending it that proves impossible. The question that hangs heavy over the region tonight is not just about nuclear centrifuges or naval tonnage. It is about pride, survival, and the terrifying momentum of machines set in motion. When you assemble this much firepower in one place, you create a gravity well that pulls everything towards conflict. It takes immense political will to reverse that momentum, and right now, looking at the statements from both capitals, that appears to be entirely absent. We are watching a train wreck in slow motion, hoping that someone, somewhere, pulls the emergency brake before impact. This brings us to the most volatile variable in this equation, one that no amount of naval tonnage can fully neutralize: the asymmetric network. While the world's cameras are fixed on the aircraft carriers in the Gulf, the real fuse may be lit thousands of miles away. Intelligence reports indicate that proxy militias across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen have moved to a war footing. This is the ring of fire strategy that Tehran has cultivated for decades. The calculation here is terrifyingly simple. If the U.S. strikes Iranian soil, the response will not just come from Iranian missile silos. It will erupt from every corner of the Middle East simultaneously. U.S. embassies, forward operating bases, and allied capitals could face a coordinated swarm of drone and rocket attacks, turning a localized naval punitive strike into a sprawling, chaotic regional conflagration that stretches from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Inside the Pentagon, war planners are grappling with the nightmare of horizontal escalation. The Armada is designed to dominate the sea and air, but it is less effective against small, mobile militia units hiding in dense urban environments. If the conflict widens, the United States could find itself dragged back into the very ground wars in the Middle East that it has spent the last decade trying to exit. This is the paradox of American power in the 21st century. The military is invincible in a conventional head-to-head fight, but increasingly vulnerable to the death-by-a-thousand-cuts tactics of asymmetric warfare. The administration is betting that the threat of overwhelming force will freeze these proxies in place, but fear is a fickle tool. If the ideological fervor of these groups overrides their survival instinct, the region will burn. We must also look inward, at the domestic front back in the United States. The standoff is unfolding against a backdrop of deep political polarization and war fatigue. The American public, still reeling from the economic and social aftershocks of recent years, has little appetite for another foreign adventure. However, the narrative being crafted in Washington is one of peace through strength. The argument is that only by showing the ultimate weapon can you prevent its use. It is a high-wire act of political theater, where the audience is the entire world. If the administration blinks, U.S. credibility collapses. If they strike and get bogged down, the political fallout will be catastrophic. The president is effectively pushing all chips to the center of the table, betting his legacy on the belief that Tehran will fold first. But what if they don't? What if the hardliners in Tehran view this not as a threat to be managed, but as a divine test to be endured? We are seeing signs of a society preparing for siege. In the bazaars of Tehran and Isfahan, ordinary Iranians are hoarding staples, rice, oil, medicine. The currency has plummeted, wiping out savings overnight. These are the people who will pay the price for the decisions made in hardened bunkers. History teaches us that sanctions and threats often rally a population around the flag, creating a siege mentality that strengthens the very regime the pressure was meant to crack. The tragic irony is that the average Iranian citizen, often the most vocal critic of their own government, is now the primary victim of this geopolitical squeeze. There is a technological dimension here that adds a layer of existential dread. We are no longer in the era of slow-moving wars. The weapon systems currently pointing at each other, hypersonic missiles, autonomous drones, and AI-driven air defense systems, operate at speeds that exceed human reaction times. In a hot scenario, the decision to fire might be made by an algorithm detecting an incoming threat, not a human commander. We are delegating the power of life and death to software. If a cyber glitch or a sensor error interprets a civilian airliner or a flock of birds as an attack profile, the automated systems could unleash a volley of interceptors and counterstrikes before a human operator can even shout, "Abort!" We have built a machine of war so perfect and so fast that it may have outpaced our ability to control it. As we approach the final hours of this ultimatum, the diplomatic back channels are eerily silent. Usually there is a frenzy of last-minute offers and counteroffers, but this time the silence suggests a fatalistic acceptance on both sides. The Europeans, usually the mediators, are standing on the sidelines, realizing their influence has evaporated. The UN Security Council is paralyzed by vetoes and gridlock. The guardrails that were built after World War II to prevent exactly this kind of scenario have rusted away. We are left with the raw, naked mechanics of power. Force versus force. Will versus will. In these final moments before the deadline, we are forced to confront the reality of modern conflict. It is sanitary only on television. On the screen, it looks like green night vision footage and precision strikes, but on the ground, it is chaos, fire, and ruin. If the Armada unleashes its payload, the shockwaves will shatter not just concrete, but the fragile stability of the entire global order. Markets will crash, borders will dissolve, and the human cost will be tallied in generations of trauma. The surgical strike is a myth. War is a blunt instrument, and once it is swung, no one knows where it will land. We are standing on the precipice. The ships are in position. The missiles are fueled. The rhetoric has reached a point of no return. What happens next will be written in history books, either as the moment the world stepped back from the brink or the moment it plunged into the abyss. The world is holding its breath, waiting for a signal, a word, or a spark. The waiting is the hardest part because in the silence of the standoff, you can almost hear the ticking of the clock. The clock is running out. This is the reality of the standoff in the Gulf. It is a story of power, pride, and the terrifying fragility of peace. As the sun sets over the destroyers and the desert silos, the fate of millions rests in the hands of a few. We will continue to watch, to report, and to wait. Because in a world armed to the teeth, the only thing more dangerous than the noise of war is the silence just before it begins. This is the breaking story, and this is only the beginning of the end.